but like where you can, progressives, that's what I have. Okay, everybody. Well, why don't we get started here? And again, it's great to have everybody out. Good to have a great turnout. I'm going to pray and open. You know, we're still a church, even though this is a lecture of sorts. And then I want to introduce the occasion of our lecture and then also our lecturer. So join me in prayer. God and Father, we give you thanks and praise for the opportunity to gather as the body of Christ in this place, to enjoy a meal together, fellowship, and to have our minds expanded and stimulated, and to appreciate the work of one of your great servants, C.S. Lewis. Bless us this evening, our children, as they watch and do their thing, and then us as we reflect on Lewis's work. Enrich and edify us in our hearts and in our minds and our imaginations, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So the occasion of this lecture, and we have two more lectures after this. One of them is Fabrice Jauderand, and I don't know, he's going to talk on transhumanism. I was thinking, like, what could I make for transhumanism? It would probably be a kind of like synthetic meat product. Okay, I had to get that joke out. So our church received through the Creation Project that's hosted at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School something that's called the John Stott Fellowship, and we receive funding in order to have conversations around faith and science. And the theme this year is on the image of God, and there's a lot of different components to this, but part of the money, we have money to use, and so one of the things that we put together was a lecture series, the first one being this one, and then the other ones will be after the first of the year. And it looks at the relationship and the intersection of faith and science around the question of what does it mean to be a person, or anthropology. And so this is our first one this year, or this season, on C.S. Lewis, and I've encouraged a number of people in the congregation, or anybody who wants to read Perelandra, which is the second of Lewis's books. Mickey will talk about that. But I also I want to introduce Dr. Mickey Mattox. Dr. Mattox is one of the first people I actually met in Milwaukee 16 years ago when I came here to visit Marquette to do a PhD. He was one of the people I visited. And he's been a great mentor over the years. Mickey is a professor. I don't know what your technical title at Marquette is. He is full professor in Reformation history, and Mickey is an internationally recognized Martin Luther scholar. Many people come to Marquette to study Luther with Dr. Mattox. Mickey has a PhD. He actually has an MDiv from Trinity. Most people don't know that, TEDS. And then a PhD from Duke University in Reformation history. And he worked with David Steinmetz, who is a very well-known, recently deceased Reformation scholar. And then Mickey spent time, 4 years, at the Ecumenical Institute in Strasbourg, and then came to Marquette to teach Reformation history, which he still holds the same post now. I go back and forth between Dr. Mattox and Mickey, but Mickey, I should just say, he's he's a very close friend of mine. He lives across the street. And his wife as well, Pam, is very close. And so we see each other a lot. But he's here talking not simply because he's a good friend that we smoke a lot of cigars and talk a lot of theology on our front porches, but actually he understands theology well. He understands C.S. Lewis well. He, for the past 4 years, is it? Mickey has been teaching a class in C.S. Lewis at Marquette to undergrads, and it is one of the most popular classes in the theology department easily. And so each year, I'll hear the syllabus and I'll hear about what particular books they're reading. And it's really helped me too. Some of you who hear me listen to me on Sunday mornings are like, man, heavy on the Lewis these days. And some part is just from our conversations, because Lewis he's such a great conversation partner. He was very perceptive ahead of his time of some of the trends in culture. And so it was very exciting to be able to ask Mickey to come and give this lecture. And he is a man of deep faith. Mickey became a Roman Catholic when he came to Marquette, maybe a year after he came here. And one of the interesting things about Lewis is that Lewis is a figure that spans the sort of ecclesial divisions and divides. Roman Catholics love C.S. Lewis, Protestants love C.S. Lewis. There's something about Lewis. He talks about mere Christianity. He himself was an Anglican, but he was very Catholic. And we talk here about being Catholic, but in a reformed way. And so I thought it was great to be able to have Mickey to come and share this lecture. I won't take up any more of his time, but he is a very close friend and mentor, and just it's been good. And so I'm excited to have him here. So welcome, Dr. Mattox, to City Reformed Church.
Thank you so much, Chris, for a nice introduction. It's wonderful to see you all here. I'm excited to talk with you about C.S. Lewis and other matters of interest for you. I want to say as I start that I have a heart full of gratitude for the Reformed tradition broadly. This is a Reformed church. Pam and I were influenced a lot at certain points in our lives, especially when we were younger, by the Reformed tradition. I count as Reformed people among my best friends, including Chris, and also theologians and others whom I respect a great deal. So it's an honor for me to be here to speak with you. I love what you do in this church, and if there's some way that I can be helpful to you in offering faithful witness to Jesus in a kind of crazy time like the one we live in, then I am very happy to be able to do that. So, tonight I'm going to talk about C.S. Lewis, and I want to begin with this image. I'm kind of a walker and talker, so they've got me wired so I can just come out here and kind of get right with you, you know. Oh, I forgot my clicker. I see, I can even do that. This image I like a great deal. There's a central character in the so-called Space Trilogy of C.S. Lewis. A little bit later on, I'll try and help you understand why people who work with Lewis think we should call it something other than the Space Trilogy, but we'll get there in a minute or two. The central figure in the story is Elwyn Ransom. Certainly the last name is not at all accidental. Lewis is planning a whole lot here. And so I wanted to begin talking about the Space Trilogy and Elwyn Ransom with an image that I think is very evocative for this figure in Lewis's writing. This is an image that shows Elwyn on the road. There's a way that we say this in Catholic tradition, and I count you all as Catholics in this broad sense. We are all somehow on the way. We are all on the road. We all see a horizon and don't know what lies beyond it. We see rises and dips in the road ahead. And so we look for wisdom, and we walk, and we try and walk faithfully. That's what I hope I can help with a little bit tonight. So this image strikes me as quite nice. It's Elwyn Ransom. He's a professor. He's a philologist, which is a really odd profession. I mean, he's the kind of professor that almost nobody pays any attention to, except when they need specialized kinds of help. He seems to be completely unattached when we meet him in the Space Trilogy. No, he's not married. He doesn't have kids. There's no wider family. He has friends and colleagues, but he's a bit of a loner, and he loves to walk out in the countryside. Now, this signals for us right away that one of Lewis's abiding concerns throughout the whole Space Trilogy will be the beauty, the dignity, and the voice of natura, of nature. Nature speaks to us. Your nature speaks to me, right? These are very important things to keep in mind as you turn your minds to transhumanism. So our image begins with this figure on the road, and I would encourage you to think of yourself likewise as a person on the road, looking ahead, wondering if you'll be up to whatever tasks may come your way. Oh. Let's try that one more time. How about that? You have to actually turn on the slideshow, apparently. So yeah, I've called this Introduction to the Ransom Trilogy. There's that other name, right? It turns out, as you read the Space Trilogy, that Lewis explicitly denies that there is any such thing as space. Why? Because we think of space as that empty thing, that place where nothing is. And Lewis thinks there is no such thing, because God fills and knows and sees all things. So, Ransom Trilogy is maybe a better label. What does that suggest right off the bat? Well, it suggests that this is a story of a soul, that figure we just saw on the road is going to be in action, in movement, going somewhere. Things are going to happen to him. Challenges are going to come up for him, and he won't know in advance whether he is really up to them. So to this extent, this trilogy is a sort of, it's an example of a classic genre, a type of Christian literature, namely hagiography. It's a saint's life. It's the story of a soul, the story of a saint. So if you're looking for faith and faithfulness, Lewis wants to narrate you into the sort of mindset where you begin to see your own life as filled with moral challenges, not unlike, even if not as dramatic, as, say, those of Elwin Ransom. Here is an image of the 3 books, and I have on the side here the publication date. These are important dates. We have to remind ourselves that Lewis had a day job, so writing books like this was totally a sideline. He was actually very busy as a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Oxford University. He was a powerful and a popular professor, a great lecturer. He was involved in all kinds of things. He was aggressive, out there, always ready for an argument. He loved it. He loved the academic life. So while he's writing the kinds of books that professors are supposed to write, he is also starting to write this kind of literature. One thing I'd like to say about this, scholars sometimes say that Lewis became disillusioned with the project of Christian apologetics after a certain philosophical encounter with someone in public where he didn't do too well. And so the idea then is that Lewis became disillusioned with apologizing for the faith and instead retreated into the world of fantasy. This is untrue because the event that people point to occurs long after Lewis began writing the Space Trilogy. Sorry, I somehow hit a button, didn't I? Thank you. Kate, I think your look of concern was meant to telegraph that. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. All right. So yeah. So you can see here, I love these book covers. Oh, I have a red thing. Here, let's see if I can make that. Oh, yes. I feel so, I haven't been using this for a while, so here it is. So yeah, the first one is Out of the Silent Planet. Have people read this? Maybe a few. Oh, good. Oh, that's great. So I love this image. You can see here that they're in the spaceship on the cover, right? And you can see that there are 2 guys on the left. What's a little harder to see is that there's a guy right here. And so, who can help me? Who are these guys? Can you figure it out? That's definitely Weston at the controls, right? So Weston is driving the spaceship, and then there's Dick Devine next to him, right? Peering out there, and they're approaching Mars, obviously. And then here off on the side, almost as an afterthought, a man in the shadows. And the man in the shadows is, of course, Professor Ransom. He's going to have to come out of the shadows, even though he really doesn't want to. Now, I know that some of you are already reading Perelandra. Hands? Just for fun? Okay, cool. Perelandra is just a straight-up amazing book. I think it's easily either the very best or the second best of all of Lewis's writings. So we can talk about that maybe a little bit later. You see in this image that the red hand reaching out obviously appears demonic, right? And this red hand is reaching out from our planet, where we have these problems, and it's reaching toward this unspoiled world. I don't know why that's doing that. It's reaching toward this unspoiled world, and you can see that the publisher has initially put this out under the title Voyage to Venus on the supposition that Perelandra won't sell. Thankfully now it is Perelandra, so publishers aren't always right. And so the adventure continues there. Ransom is on the planet Perelandra and has some adventures there. We'll talk about that in a bit. Then the third text is That Hideous Strength. That Hideous Strength is the book my students struggle the most with because it's long. I kind of don't get it though. I really don't understand their struggles because if you've read That Hideous Strength, you know it's a page turner. You keep wondering, well, who killed that guy? Or what's going on? Or who is that going to really be? Or how will they solve that? It's a kind of almost like a whodunit reading kind of text. So I don't quite sympathize with that. Now, I want to point out, Perelandra is published in 1942. What was Lewis doing in 1942? The answer is he was walking the streets at night carrying a rifle for the Home Guard. He had been, of course, a soldier in the First World War and had been wounded and carried shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life. He turned 19 in the trenches in France. I think when you think about Lewis, you have to think about him a little bit like Catholics and many other people think of Karl Wojtyla, Pope John Paul II. When I think of Pope John Paul II, who grew up in Poland and came of age under the Nazi occupation, where they took the entire faculty of the university out and shot them dead, right? If anyone had a right to grow up cynical, not believing in the human race, it was Karl Wojtyla. Something like that, I think, is also true of C.S. Lewis. And it is quite interesting that one of his lifelong friends was also a young man fighting in the First World War, a guy he knew as Tollers, J.R.R. Tolkien, his good friend. I'll say a little bit more about the two of them a little bit later. But, is this, it's on its own like thing, isn't it? Oh, how cute. Thank you so much for thinking for me. By the way, I just want to say how much I really appreciate artificial intelligence. Oh, I'm so into it, you know. Okay, so yeah, it turns out in 1942, in his day job, Lewis published what many people might say was his most important writing, namely a lengthy preface to Milton's Paradise Lost. Right? He would probably be well known, at least in certain circles, if that were the only thing he had published. Right? At least I have this on authority from my colleagues in the English department. Now, Perelandra is a kind of an imaginative exploration of just what Milton was doing in Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is a reflection on the fall of humankind into sin and the kind of logic of a creature that would tempt them to do this, and the psychology that would lead them to follow and try the same thing themselves, right? So Lewis is deep into this thought world already through his own work, while at the same time he's firing off this little science fiction series on his own. Now, by the way, his label for this kind of writing was scientifiction. It wasn't quite called science fiction yet. He was an avid reader of science fiction writers, which is interesting for a guy who does the kind of thing he did. So you can see the whole series was out by 1945. Now, I want to mention the universe that that the Space Trilogy takes place in, okay? And there are some differences, but it's a lot like the old cosmos. This is a graph of the cosmos back in the day when people thought that the Earth was at the center and the moon and Venus and even the sun, Jupiter and Saturn all revolved around the Earth. Here's a little bit more standardized picture of that same thing. Now, what's important for us to know, you can see that it begins with Earth and then works its way all the way out through the planets and so on. What's important for us to know is that Lewis thought of this as a really effective vehicle of the imagination. Why? Because Lewis was a scholar of pre-modern literature when this way of seeing the world prevailed. And so he well knew that Christian people had accommodated themselves to this way of seeing all things, recognizing themselves somehow at the center, and yet the center itself being somehow at the periphery, and using that to sort of fill in their way of understanding the world. Now, this image I like a lot. I hope this doesn't just jump away on me. This, by the way, is the cosmos. It's the universe of the Chronicles of Narnia. We know from the work of a guy named Michael Ward that when Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, he didn't tell anybody this. He kept it completely secret. But it seems absolutely sure that Lewis patterned those books after the 7 planets, so that, for example, the voyage of the Dawn Treader takes place in the sphere of the sun. Now, what I want you to think about just a little bit here, because Lewis is interested in this, I want you to think about the ways that Christian people before the modern era had appropriated the wisdom of their time, not just the ideas about the cosmos, but also ideas about the influences of the cosmos on we human beings. So they thought that the planets would influence them. They thought that, well, if you were born under this constellation, or if that planet was rising when you were born, that they could predict something about you, that they could understand their lives in this way. So the notion that you could be under the influence of a planet was very popular and somehow brought together with Christian conviction about God and Jesus and the saints and creation and the whole thing. So Lewis knew this old cosmos really well. He wrote a whole book about this. It was the one text of Lewis that I would say was kind of a show-off book. He wrote a book called The Discarded Image. He wrote it while he was at Cambridge University, having left Oxford, where they would never give him, like, full professor. They would never really make him, give him the kind of recognition he had well earned, right? So finally, they tempted him to come to Cambridge, and he wrote then this book, The Discarded Image. And The Discarded Image is a kind of sort of eulogy for an old way of seeing the world, one that Lewis loved very much, because he thought this, and I think you may think this too, the cosmos, the world, the universe that we live in, the account that we hear about it, makes it really hard for us to believe that our lives have meaning and purpose. It's really hard to narrate as a meaningful story the Big Bang and all the galaxies and the crazy stuff that goes on there. Lewis recognized that we have this problem, and he was at work in some way trying to tell a story again that would engage our imaginations and inspire us internally to ask ourselves, what can we do to be faithful here and now, today? Now, when Lewis writes the Space Trilogy, he imagines the old cosmos just a little bit rearranged, okay? So he's put the sun at the center. He calls it our bowl. Therefore, all the spheres around our bowl constitute the sort of region that is under the influence of our bowl. And he's got them all sort of charted out. He's given them all names. Isn't it impressive what imaginative work he did? I mean, I know that I could never even begin to write something imaginative like this, but he does this in his spare time while he's walking around at night carrying that rifle, watching for the things that may happen. And so Thulkandra and Sulva, can you see the words okay? It's kind of hard, a little blurry. Yeah, a little messy. Thulkandra and Sulva, this is the Earth and the Moon. Paralandra is the next planet in toward the sun. Malacandra, which Ransom visits in Out of the Silent Planet, is the next planet out from us. Lewis is picturing all these as inhabited, all these as being under the care of ruling intelligences that are bringing forth from them life and goodness. Now it's interesting because sometimes Lewis will think a little bit like a creationist, so that things are happening kind of suddenly. Most of the time, at least in Paralandra, and you check me on this, you tell me what you think, it sounds more like a kind of directed evolution, where God is present in and through angelic presences, for example, and God is guiding things in some way, so that life is emerging under God's guidance. But nevertheless, it is emerging sort of evolutionarily, something like that. I'm sure that your church has had a conversation about evolution and creation at some point, right? So, beginning with Out of the Silent Planet, again, we ask these questions. Who was Ransom at the beginning of these stories, and who has he become by the time we reach their end? Well, it seems that Ransom has become a man of real faith. What do we mean by that? He has a faith that has been tested, right? How many of you know the musician Bruce Cockburn? This guy Bruce Cockburn? Yeah. He has a lovely song that I like a lot, especially now that I'm an old guy, right? It's called Tried and Tested. Tried and tested. And so that's who Ransom is, a man who has been tried and tested. You know that you have faith when your faith has been put to the test. We also see that he's a man of character. You can count on him. He's a good friend. He knows how to do the right thing, not just the nice thing. He does what one should do. We also see that he's a person of courage. You have this quite vividly on display in Paralandra. And then lastly, I would add, because I know some of you have been reading The Abolition of Man, yes? And so The Abolition of Man is a very difficult text. I struggle with that a great deal myself. When I teach it to undergraduate students, I feel like this may be just impossible. I want to say, I think that Lewis could have said more clearly what he was trying to say. But he was saying it before almost anybody else. And so when you're the first person to get there and you don't quite know how to describe the thing or explain it, we should be respectful at least, huh? So Ransom has become a man with a chest. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along, but I would note for the present that the chest is situated between the belly, the passions, the hungers, right? And the mind, reason, cool rationality. So the chest is that middle element in the human being. Also, the characters Weston and Divine. I would read these as representative in some sense of two forces that Lewis is really apprehensive about. One is not science, but scientism. Weston epitomizes this kind of crazy confidence in science, that it has all the answers, that it's the way of knowing not just this world, but all possible worlds, right? So the kind of arrogance and intellectual pretension of science when it becomes an entire worldview, that I think is what Lewis sees, or what he portrays in the character Weston. I want to make sure, if you've read Paralandra, you know this. Ransom gives Weston full credit. He was an amazing man. He was an accomplished scientist. He was brilliant. He epitomized many things that are special characteristics of our race. He deserves much praise, right? But he fell prey to something that took him down and cost him everything. Right? So we have Weston on the one hand, and then we have Dick Devine, who's later Lord Featherstone. And Dick Devine epitomizes something else. I want to tell you a little sidebar here. My undergraduate degree is in economics. I spent 5 years working for banks. I made loans. I also collected loans. I worked on foreclosures, bankruptcies, you know. I know a little about money. I know a little about capitalism. And I've never been like, you know, anti-capitalist. So I'm not on an anti-capitalist campaign, okay? Nevertheless, there are some issues that folks ought to be concerned about. And Lewis, I think, was able to see them. And what he portrays in particular here is the peculiar late modern partnership between capitalism and scientism. These two things working together in a way that Lewis thought was undermining our sense of dignity, undermining our ability to grasp nature as a given good, and undermining much else besides. Sorry, I'm a little distracted by my slideshow that wants to go on without me. Okay, so why is this a problem? Why is it a problem that capitalism and scientism work in concert together? Here they are, Dick Devine and Weston, headed off to Malacandra. What for? Riches, fame, business opportunities, expanding the human race. In some ways, they kind of epitomize the great myth of our day, right? The great myth of our day, NASA is at the center, yes? Aren't we all supposed to be looking for the kind of meaning that we could find if we could discover whether we are alone in the universe? Isn't this constantly pitched to us as a way for answering these fundamental questions? I always wonder myself, so what if you did find something? What then? What would you say to them? Is there a God? They would say, I don't know, we're looking. You know, maybe then you have a partner for it. So what is the problem with the partnership between capitalism and scientism? And here I want to say something kind of heady, sort of big intellectual, not because I'm a big intellectual, because some other people have done this, right? And the big thing I want to try and say is that modernity, the modern project, sometimes we say, the modern world, with all its efforts and pretensions, its self-understanding, its story, right? The modern world is endless. Endless, in this case, however, means not that it goes on forever, but rather it has no goal. It doesn't go somewhere. It has no answer to the question, what for? And even more than that, has no answer to the question, why are we human beings special? Are we? So this, I think, comes back to the theme of your series, that is the image of God. Perelandra is a different kind of book, published, as I said, in the same year as his preface to Paradise Lost. In Perelandra, he reimagines at length the moral drama of the original human temptation to make ourselves like God, knowing good and evil. Now here, you've heard I'm a Catholic, so I'm going to just come out of the closet here and say, you know, I sometimes watch these online sermons done by a certain friend of mine. And so it happens that I listened to one a couple of weeks ago. What was the title? That was it. Clothing the New Humanity. That was it. Yeah. And so, well, we have a woman here in a state of undress, so maybe the clothing part kind of comes to mind. This, by the way, of course, is the Green Lady. I love this image. My culture is so over-sexualized that I hesitate even to show this image in class. I do it. I do it because my students need to know that the body is more than just a sexual object, right? And of course, Ransom's experience in Perelandra with the Green Lady all takes place in the nude. Now, fun fact to know and tell, yes, Lewis liked to skinny dip. He really did, you know. They had a pond out back. I know it's a terrible thought, you know, but they had a pond out back, you know, where they lived there in Oxford, and he would indeed do that quite regularly and was well known for that. Lewis didn't have a shame about being an embodied creature. I think he celebrated in a certain way, going out there and sort of being au naturel with nature, in and with and among it, right? So this relationship between Ransom and the Green Lady is in some ways like a paradigmatic relationship for our age. Why so? Because it's a man and a woman, and even the hint of sexual dalliance is never present. Ransom never thinks that about her. He always knows what? She's not for me, right? She likewise, I'm sure, never looks at him that way either. Now, I want to go back to the clothing the new humanity, because it is in this text that Lewis does something I think pretty special with some of those old classic questions regarding Genesis and the garden and the snake and the knowledge of good and evil and the woman and should you try it and so on. What he shows by means of this story, Lewis doesn't narrate this. He's not doing, I mean, he does narrate this. He doesn't do what I'm doing, lecture on it, teach didactically what's in there, right? Instead, he tells a story that shows. And what does the story show? It shows that there is a right way to know good and evil, and there is a wrong way to know good and evil. So the human desire to know is fundamental to what we are, and God means to reward it. We are not to be afraid of knowledge or inquiry, new things, right? But we should also somehow recognize that there's a wrong way to go about this. And that story, I think, is paradigmatic for that. Yeah, I think I'm probably just about done with that. I'm being a little careful because I don't want to do any spoilers. How many people are halfway through Paralandra? Okay, I'm going to be real quiet. Her name is Tinadrill. That's all you need to know. Okay. Now, when you come to the final book in the series, That Hideous Strength, things are really quite different. All the action takes place on Earth, but the interesting thing that's occurred is the wicked one, and there is a wicked one, right? The wicked one has reached out from Earth toward first Malacandra, Mars, and then secondly, Paralandra. And it's as if Lewis has in mind a sort of old construct according to which the devil has sort of rights, but the rights are strictly restricted to like planet Earth. So if the devil can do stuff, the devil isn't God or a second God. The devil isn't omnipresent. The devil is confined. And so in these stories, the devil is seeking to escape this confinement, right? And Lewis's idea then is that these efforts, the reaching out to Malacandra where he shouldn't be, the reaching out to Paralandra where he shouldn't be, that these somehow violate the terms of Satan's restriction to planet Earth. And the consequence is that he brings down high heaven upon himself, right? And so in the image that I showed you from the book cover from the 1940s, the sun and the spheres are shown here in very close proximity to the buildings that are being torn down. These are the human constructs, the human efforts. It's the work of that crazy company. They're called, by the way, the NICE, which is, you know, kind of cheap, but, you know, you gotta like it. It means National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. It sounds just like a government bureau, right? And Lewis had very little patience for bureaus and bureaucrats. But yeah, so the idea is that that's the NICE, that's their building, it's all their great plans, it's everything they were going to do, and high heaven has come down and disrupted it. Now, Lewis thinks that what the NICE was about, broadly, is what the sociologist Max Weber called rationalization. What this means is taking our human world of place and kinship and family and all those sorts of things, and straightening them out, making them function in a kind of logical, rational way. And so Weber thought what was going on in the broader world for the modern period is this thing called rationalization. Clearly, Lewis is unhappy about a world that has been rationalized to the extent that I can no longer recognize myself as an intelligent animal living in community with others, right? So he's worried about those things. This is a society that values efficiency over, for example, relationality. And they are involved in a project that sort of foreshadows that thing we now call transhumanism, right? Remaking the human thing. Well, of course, if you're going to remake the human, I mean, why make them temporary? Why not make them last forever? By the way, if you think I'm just, like an academic who's just spinning out yarns here, check it out. Check it out. Just check it out. Ray Kurzweil is the main proponent, I think, of a certain kind of transhumanism. He is like senior executive vice president at a little company you may have heard of called Google. And they run an institute devoted to his vision for transforming the human race and enabling us first to live very long lives, 500, 1,000 years, and then eventually to live indefinitely. You couldn't really say eternally, I don't think, but yeah, so that's the project. So Lewis thinks all this is really bad stuff. Why? Because it disables us from finding ourselves in our given humanity as vulnerable, temporal, needy, needing one another. So it's a new world that Lewis thinks is not a good world. What happens in the end of this text then is that the high heavens come down, and so we have here a kind of apocalypse. We began on a road with Ransom, looking for a place to spend the night in Out of the Silent Planet. We wind up, by the end of that hideous strength, with an apocalypse. What is an apocalypse? Apocalypse means simply an unveiling. It's where suddenly you see what somehow before you didn't see, what was hidden, what was behind the curtain. And this is how apocalypse happens in the sort of classic Christian imagination. It comes down from above, right? This, by the way, is a very difficult concept for modern people to take seriously. Why? Well, first of all, we don't believe there are any gods up there. So if there's going to be an apocalypse, where's it going to come from? Answer, probably we're going to do it ourselves. It'll be a nuclear war, or I don't know, a biological disaster of some kind. But in any case, if there's an agent of apocalypse, we are it, right? So you could think about this in terms of environmental degradation and all that sort of thing. Yeah. Now, let's talk a little bit about Lewis's classic work, The Abolition of Man. Let me check how am I doing time-wise, Chris? Yeah. Okay. All right. Would you guys like me to stop? Do you want to chat a little bit about the Space Trilogy? Do you have questions about things I said? Are there comments you'd like to make? Worries you have? Do you need another beer? Yeah? Yeah, please.
I'm curious, do students pick up particularly on scientism and Out of the Silent Planet?
Yes, because I make sure they do. Yeah. The students have a hard time with that. My perception is that students can't read books anymore. I don't think that's an overstatement. I think that's just a straight up fact. My colleagues will even say that they don't require books anymore because students won't read them. I'm old-fashioned, so I assign them books and then I give them in-class quizzes on the content. So, they're either going to read it or, not do very well. So, yeah, I think they have a hard time. And of course, the myth of science is so pervasive in our culture that very few people are aware they hold it. They don't even know they believe that. Lewis can kind of wake them up. Yeah.
You think at some level reading books is inefficient?
Okay. Yeah, I get that.
I would say like why they won't because it's not efficient.
Yeah.
You can read an article, why they read like a 300-page novel.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a reason. I don't know.
Yes, I think efficiency is a reason why people think along these lines. It troubles me though, if you have a book-length exploration like Paralandra. You spend a lot of time with the Green Lady, with Ransom, with Weston. Weston is tempting her. He's making every argument he can think of. The ins and outs are intense. And that kind of richness, depth, subtlety, that's why you should fear people who won't or don't or can't read. Right? Especially college-educated people who will be occupying positions of responsibility. Because that capacity to take in, to learn, to discern, to recognize the complexity, both sides of the issue, I think those things are very much at stake. What else? Yeah.
Two related questions. Why do you think your courses that you offer Marquette are so popular on C.S. Lewis?
Oh.
And secondly, assuming that's true, and secondly,
yeah, really.
I believe it. So.
Well, Chris is, we are friends.
The other question I have is, among students, and I assume it's mostly undergrads, who take your classes on C.S. Lewis,
Yeah.
do you see small lights go on, medium lights go on, large lights go on, or what kind of...
It's the most exciting thing I do at Marquette. My day job is Martin Luther. So I do Martin Luther and Protestant Reformation, I do 16th century theology, and when I teach a doctoral seminar at Marquette, I have a lot of fun with the students there. But for undergraduate teaching, when I try and connect with students about theology, it almost always fails. At least that's how it feels to me as a teacher. It's a difficult world for young people right now. They're afraid of each other. They're not really afraid of me anymore. Teachers are kind of toothless now, but they're afraid of one another. They're afraid of a viral video. They're afraid of what people will say about them on social media. So my students are a little bit frozen. So what happens with Lewis is somehow the room comes to life. It does. Now, the reason I teach C.S. Lewis is seated in the back row next to my wife. That is our son, who 10 or 12 years ago asked me, "Dad, does anybody in your department teach a C.S. Lewis course?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, why don't you teach one?" And I said, "Well, I can't do that." He said, "Why not?" This is true, isn't it?
That's verbatim.
I think that's exactly right. And so I did, and I didn't know what I was doing. And what I found is that the students were so delighted by Lewis that I could tell, something was really at work there. And so I have been doing this for quite a while now. And I can tell you, I sometimes have students in the room who just come alive with questions. It's not uncommon. First day of class, the first day of real class, we introduce it one day and then everybody goes home and read, and then we come back. And I say, "Well, any questions or comments about the reading?" I get 15 hands. Trust me, this never happens in any other theology class I teach. It just doesn't happen. And so the success of the class, if there is success, is really Lewis himself. Yeah, please.
So I'm also a teacher in medicine. What do you think it is about Lewis that appeals to today's undergrads? Like, what about him pulls them out that gets them so involved?
Oh, yeah.
Because, I have doctoral students, right?
Yeah.
Who are specializing in my field, and it's sometimes really hard to get them interested in anything, let alone read anything that's not
May I ask, what is your field?
anesthesiology.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. So I was going to begin my talk tonight this way. Two guys walk into a bar. True story. The two guys who walk into the bar are Jack and Tollers, Jack Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. They walk into what they call the Bird and the Baby. It's the Eagle and public house, a pub, in Oxford. They meet there with friends of theirs who are all called the Inklings, right? People who think that we all have a kind of inkling of the truth. And this idea that we all have a kind of inkling of the truth somehow deep inside us, they come up with the idea, you know, we really ought to try and awaken that, because modern British education, mind you, this is the 1930s, modern British education is destroying the imaginations, especially the moral imaginations of young people. We ought to do something about this. And so they talk about this and they say, what is the sort of, what are the parameters that we ought to be concerned about? And the answer comes quickly: space and time. I can't believe they thought that, because for myself as a teacher, as a historian, everybody today comes to college knowing for sure that the past is irrelevant. Why am I teaching it? Why do you, we have this many requirements in history at Marquette. I say zero, none, not one. No student must take a history course at Marquette, right? So Jack and Tollers, I think, like flip a coin. And it turns out, Lewis says, I'll take the space story, and Tollers says, okay, I'll take the time story. Now, Lewis really ticked off Tolkien. Why? Because he pushed these 3 books out within 7 years, right? And Tolkien is at work on his for decades, you know. Now, he also thought that Lewis was a little ham-handed with the way he handled you know, allegory and this sort of thing. So he had some kind of professional criticism, and they were in a group where you could say those sorts of things to one another. But their very intentional effort is to provide material that awakens students to what's already inside them. So they both have this idea of like archetypes, that there's a kind of collective unconscious. There are these sort of figures that constantly appear in human history. And if we have an educational system that deafens students to these sounds they already somehow know, then we've done them a huge disservice and put our world, you know, at peril. And so Lewis and Tolkien both want to, and here's the key word, they both want to re-enchant. We live in an enchanted world, but most of us don't know it. Lewis and Tolkien thought that they could use story as a vehicle to awaken us to the truth about our world, about our lives. I think that's what happens with my kids in the classroom. Yeah.
You mentioned that you think Paralandra is Lewis's second best book. What do you think is his first?
Well, I'm being very politic here. I think it is his best book. My son thinks it is his second best book, and a lot of people think that too. He wrote a story late in life, Till We Have Faces. And Till We Have Faces is a very different book than anything else Lewis ever wrote, and it's straight up amazing. And I gotta say, I usually finish my Lewis course with that, and the students are just blown away. I mean, he rocks the house. But I will say this, the last 15 pages of Paralandra is on the level of the greatest mystical theological traditions of the Catholic and Orthodox tradition. It's just straight up amazing stuff. So that's why I love that so much myself. Yes?
I 1,000,000% confirm what you just said with the last 50 pages. It's just astonishing.
Yes.
Really,
Yes.
it's like worshipful. It's like literally like doxology. It's incredible.
Yes, it is a doxology.
It's doxology,
Yeah. Yeah.
So, kind of go back to Tom's question about when the lights go on for.
Yeah.
Because obviously in theology it's harder to connect there. Are they asking theological questions when they
The
start,
students?
Like the students in the C.S. Lewis? Does it bring up like theology? Sure.
See, I got a little secret. The evangelical kids, the ones who are involved in InterVarsity, the serious Catholic kids in our group called Ignite, and a few others who made the mistake of signing up for my class, you know, all kind of end up in there. So I have kind of ringers in the audience. That is, students who are starved for this kind of thing. They are just dying for it. I think I can say this. A young woman whose mother is one of the pastors at Elmbrook Church in Brookfield, was in my class the first semester when we came back, and I mean fall 2020. I taught in the classroom the whole time. When we came back, she was in my class. She sat in the front row, and a student like that will keep the class alive because she knew her Bible, and she was always ready to raise a hand. So Lewis does appeal to the students. They pick it up. Yeah, what else? Yeah, shall we do a little bit of this? Yeah, so this is the hard stuff, and I really hesitate about this, and the reason I hesitate...
You gotta go for it.
I gotta go for it, all right, okay. Father Chris says I have to do this, so off we go. I just promoted him to priest, right? Don't tell Katie. Yeah, so I love the title of this book. This is the original publication. The Abolition of Man, or Reflections on Education with Special Reference to the Teaching of English in the Upper Forms of Schools. I mean, were you ever trying not to sell a book harder than that? You know, just like, who would buy that? When he gave these lectures, by the way, publicly, the audience was mystified. And he thought it had fallen completely flat. And yet today, this is a work that's recognized as prescient. Prescient is a word that means pre-knowing. It's as if he could see it before it actually got here, right? So maybe it was kind of here already in his day, but it has certainly that quality. So these are comments on the individual chapters. How many of you have read The Abolition of Man? Yeah. So the first chapter has to do with these two guys and their bad green book and all the problems with it and what Lewis doesn't like about it, and he jumps up and down on it and stomps on it and wants to get rid of it. But why? I think you could say it this way. He thinks the green book is modeling a kind of critical thinking that is not tethered to an account of the good. So if you don't believe in something, you can't criticize anything. So if you're criticizing everything, then you must be assuming that we all believe something. If you don't say what it is, then it's all kind of just submerged. And so Lewis thinks that what they're actually offering to these poor students is a complete philosophy of life that is deeply cynical, deeply secular, and deeply antithetical to the moral life. Lewis is a moralist. He's a moralist. And I think when you say that about him, you have to mean it in the very best way, because he's deeply serious about his own moral life. Not to say that he wasn't a sinner. Yeah. So, critical thinking not informed by a concept of the good, and Lewis then has this concept, which he calls the Tao, and of course he's gone sort of far and wide. Native American religions, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, a little Christianity and Judaism, throwing it all in there and tried to show that there is such a thing as a real morality. I think this is one of the great challenges of our world today. People just don't believe that. Except when they start expecting things of you. And I think Lewis could see this. That is to say, it's easy to be a relativist. It's easy to be amoral. In theory, it's much more difficult to actually live your life this way and not hold people accountable to what you think are really their moral obligations. So Lewis is talking about real morality, the Tao, natural law, and etc. Now, the way he portrays this is epitomized here in this classic image. Of course, this is Plato, right? How do you connect the head, the belly, and the heart? What does that have to do with the education of the young? The answer, Lewis thinks, is we have to be taught affectively to feel the world the right way. If we laugh at someone suffering, there's something wrong with us, right? If we don't laugh, if we don't find joy in the great joys of life, then there's equally something terribly wrong with us. And it turns out that lots of this kind of thing is habituated. That is to say, we catch it from the people around us, our parents, our loved ones. They teach us how to love. They teach us how to mourn. They teach us how to be happy. They teach us how to persevere in the face of difficulty, right? So here we have a classic image where the chest is ruling over reason and the appetites. So the two horses that want to drive us on Lewis's account, reason. What's the problem with reason? It's cold. It's cold, right? It's especially cold when you're talking about embodied creatures, people of flesh and blood. Reason is kind of ethereal. You just do whatever's right or do whatever makes sense. The body, on the other hand, the other horse, the body has its appetites. It has its desires. It has its wishes. And there are many, right? Now, question, what adjudicates between these two things? The body wants us to drag us down. The reason wants to drag us, off into the netherworld, the ether world, Ethernet maybe, right? So what adjudicates between the two on Lewis's account is a properly formed sensibility. Now he has a name for this, it's magnanimity. That name means greatness of spirit. So ask yourself this, would you rather be around a person who's super smart and can always figure out what's going on? Or would you rather be close to someone whose heart is full and always ready? Right? Don't you want that? Don't you want that in your own kids? Don't you want that for yourself? So the question of the education of the young then has to do with teaching them to feel the right things. Now, whenever I say this in the classroom, my students always say, well, that sounds like you're, manipulating or something like that. Lewis's point, au contraire. We have an account of the good, and we are teaching the young to live into it, to live into what is natural and right and good for them, right? Just as the guys with the green book were teaching them also a certain morality without explaining what it was. I have put this way in class before, so I'm going to go with this right now. So the question is, why be good? I don't really like the word altruism, right? I have reservations about that. But why be good? Well, Lewis says you could give a utilitarian answer. You could say, well, it's useful. It's useful for society if we train people to be good. That makes things work well. That, by the way, I think is like the prevailing explanation for things these days, right? Lewis thinks that this is a false account because you could see that utility itself cannot answer the question, why should I respect your dignity as a human being? What if I find it useful to disrespect your dignity as a human being, right? So not a good answer. He also rejects an evolutionary answer based on instinct. Why do I do what's good? Well, I have an instinct for that. Well, Lewis says, you got a lot of instincts. You got a lot of instincts. You spend a lot of time trying to adjudicate between them, don't you? So you're always asking the question, I have this instinct, I have that. Which one should I act on and why, right? And that's where the moral life lives. A better answer, Lewis thinks, is to abide within the Tao. He does use this language. Lewis thinks that if you and I depart from the Tao, if we fail to recognize real morality, then we efface, sort of tear down our own real humanity. We destroy ourselves. We dehumanize ourselves. It's less than fully human to be so. Now, Lewis worries about a society in which lots of people have done just that. And so his language for this is, if you walk within the Tao, then you always are responding. You may do it poorly sometimes, you may make the wrong decision, but you're trying to solve, right, your own moral complexities from within the framework, the given good, right? Now, Lewis thinks if you step outside the Tao, you're nowhere. You're nowhere at all. It's arbitrary willfulness only that will determine your path. And so Lewis thinks that when we do this, then we in effect abolish the human race. Now it's interesting, Michael Ward has drawn attention to Lewis's use of the word abolition here. And here you need to think a little bit of 19th century history. This was a popular word in the 19th century. How did it go? The abolition of slavery. That's precisely what Lewis means. But he doesn't mean chattel slavery. He means the kind of slavery that we find ourselves in when we have abandoned the good and no longer see ourselves as accountable to it. When we do this, the moment we step this way, we find ourselves enslaved. How so? The only direction we can find for our lives is our own willfulness, our own momentary desire, whatever pops into our head, right? So Lewis thinks that when we do this, so he's trying to say that the people who would be masters of human nature, they don't have any standard, they don't have any given good that they want to instill in their new humanity. They want to step outside of it. So to this extent, we're talking about the abolition of human nature. This is also, it's kind of like the modern technological problem. You can do so much. What limits should we have? Should there be any limits? Or should we go as far with everything as we can go, right? I guess I said all that, didn't I? So I have an image here that I use, and I also teach a course on transhumanism. I've just done this in the middle of the second time right now. I'll just be straight up self-revelatory. The university told us we have to teach a course on social justice. I think what universities want with courses on social justice for students is courses that tell the students their moral intuitions are right and their ideas are right, and here's how you ought to carry it out. My own perception as a 64-year-old 60s kid, right, is that my generation made a hell of a mess. We made a hell of a mess. And most of the time when we were doing it, we didn't even know it. We thought we were acting according to the very best principles and doing the right things, right? So the course I teach is oriented not toward, it is oriented toward action, but the path to action must go through the acquisition of wisdom. If you want to know what's the right thing to do, if you want to give it your best shot, seek wisdom. And so what I try with my students is to help them find wisdom in the matter of transhumanism. This is a big topic. Maybe it's a little odd of me to introduce that at the end. I want to end with this image. So we saw Ransom on the road in that pixelated little black and white image. On the road, everything uncertain, what will happen, all the moral challenges ahead. This is an artist's effort to give us an image of Ransom at the end of the story, when he's been, as it were, deified, when he is really participating in God and knowing God, knowing the good. He is a means of the good. He is a saint walking on earth. Now, granted, he's had some experiences most of us haven't had, travel between planets, for example, right? But nevertheless, this, I think, Lewis wants to say, is what you want for your life. You want so to be reconciled with God that you bear the peace of God within you, and that you yourself somehow become like a translucent lens through which the light of God can really shine in the unique way that is special only to you, right? Not a cookie cutter. Everybody's different. So that, I think, is what Lewis gives as sort of the moral challenge of the Christian life. That is, it's a moral challenge to really know God and become, as it were, God's witness. All right, I'm going to stop right there. Questions, comments, worries, concerns?
So,
Yep.
Becky, you talked, Lewis is very insightful in terms of the negative trends
Mhm.
and places. You mentioned scientism, and he kind of anticipates a lot of the themes that have kind of come full with transhumanism today. I'd be, and you mentioned this right towards the end here, but kind of Lewis's positive vision,
Mhm.
just glimpses of different places of what it means to be human. Just in a sort of like, it's this, right? It's like, what are the things that, you mentioned nature as an example, but like some of those positive, constructive
Sure.
examples of like, here's a human being fully
Yeah.
alive.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I love Lewis so much is because he just gives us like this picture of the constructive that I'd just be curious of your reflections on that.
Okay, so here I think immediately of the young Lewis who came home from the trenches after the war, deeply disillusioned. If you want to read some fascinating, very stout atheist poetry, read Lewis in the 1920s. I mean, he's up to here with atheism. So the question would be, having seen the downside, how did he recover a kind of upside? The answer in his case, of course, is just conversion. He was converted and became the sort of person who wanted to learn how to love. Now, with that in mind, I'd try and answer your question this way, Chris. The Four Loves, maybe some of you know it, is just an amazing book because Lewis can talk about love in very concrete ways. So, for example, he loved the smell of fresh green beans, just brought out to the table. He loved walks in the country. He loved walking by a freshly mown field where, it's that certain smell that comes. He loved all these natural things. He loved the kind of bodily affection we human beings have with our animals. And he attends to this, and he lets us, he says it's okay, you can call this love. It is a real love. So love of affection, love of kinship, the love of being near someone. So I think that Lewis is usually about attending to embodiedness. Maybe this is a kind of academic way of saying it, just recognizing that we are bodies and we live most richly when we live in embodied community with one another. That I think says something maybe about, Zoom culture. Everybody's tired of Zoom culture, but Zoom helped in a lot of ways, and no reason to say it didn't. But much to be preferred, this thing where we all meet together in person, eyeball to eyeball. I told my students at Marquette, I hope the one thing that happens as a consequence of COVID is that everybody now really knows in-person education is the gold standard. There isn't a substitute, sorry. Yeah. What else? Yep.
It seems that postmodernism produces a lot of cynicism
Yeah.
about what one can accept as truth. And I'm sensing at least that your students are still open to a different concept, but it has to sort of be released in them and broken through. Maybe you can comment just about the idea of postmodernism in the current era.
Yeah. I work in a conflicted context. Our culture is conflicted broadly. Universities like mine, and mine isn't even very distinctive in this way, we're all concerned about the kind of pluralism that we have in the classroom. So Marquette used to be like, 80% Catholic. What are we, 50 now or something like that? Maybe the number of Christians is still higher, but what can you say in the classroom that won't offend anyone? And I find that administrators will think especially about religion as a divisive force. And there are a lot of people who think that religion is divisive. What I find is that my students are really dying to be ministered to be taught in such a way that it's clear that I'm speaking to you as a human being, and I mean to address you as a Christian, not that you necessarily are, but I want to recognize this dignity in you. And so I think that we sell ourselves short when we think that people don't want to hear what we have to say. I think they do. Yeah. I don't know if that gets at.
That's it. I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah.
I think you've sum this briefly talk in a minute, but
Sure.
Lewis's conception of the myth.
What about it?
Well, I guess how that plays into the, I don't know, I guess how he thinks about the world, because Tolkien is obviously incredibly important to his version, because
Right.
he says, like, Christianity is the true myth. That,
Right.
I guess I'm thinking about sort of the postmodern condition, students, like, and
Sure.
being starved for it, like, I guess I don't know.
Well, I think when you talk about myth, again, with Lewis, it's that sort of thing where you got to think about like these collective archetypes, collective unconscious with archetypes and that sort of thing. So he thinks that that a capacity to listen, a desire to know, is built into everybody. Therefore, you can address it, and so that's what he means to do by means of this science fiction. Now, when you think about Lewis and myth, you could also think of the Christ story, and you could well ask the question, so is the whole Jesus thing, is that also myth? Like maybe just a really good one? And of course, what Lewis wants to say is, well, the Christ story is myth become fact, which is very, very significant to him. On the other hand, when he goes to Genesis 1-3, he'll say, gosh, I don't know about you guys, but I'm a literary scholar, and this looks to me like a magic apple story, right? He's just like, and of course, then that's what you get in The Magician's Nephew. It is a magic apple story. He brings it to life, and so it has a lot of power when you come at it that way. So you don't have to, I don't think exclusively about myth and fact.
No,
like,
I guess the point of like why students come alive is maybe possibly how he even, his conception of myth and how he uses that, I guess, is maybe.
He's just really good at it. He's better than the rest of us, Tolkien was critical of Lewis because, for example, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he's got Father Christmas making an appearance halfway through, and you're like, what? And so Tolkien was like, dude, you've got things all confused here. And Lewis was much more pragmatic about it. So Tolkien wanted to create a kind of self-contained world where the allegory, if there was one, to the wider world was hidden or tacit or something like that. And Lewis didn't mind being sort of out front with it. I recall a few years ago, somebody who wrote for one of those big online blogs wrote a story about how she's not a Christian and she's not raising her children to be Christians, but she's got them reading the Chronicles of Narnia, and they're reading them totally non-Christian stories. They have nothing to do with Christianity. You don't need any theology to understand that. And I thought, you poor woman, Lewis is undermining your household. Because your kids aren't going to think that. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it's sort of daunting, like at this stage to go, it's almost paralyzing.
Uh-huh.
So where do you go from here? Like, what is the avenue that the church uses to like challenge their people, to sort of embrace something more than they're living? They're like, how do we begin to awaken, I guess, Lewis, how do we awaken even ourselves? The thing is to, like, I just take in information, but it's not just a matter of taking, just do these things.
And we re-enchant ourselves.
You were just doing it tonight. You were just doing it tonight. It's this gathered community, gathered around bread and wine, gathered with loving concern for the people near you, recognition of one another. I think that sort of intentional community, I'm trying to say, if you put it in those abstract terms, is part of the answer to this question. But to be sure, we live in a super complicated world, and we live in a globalizing mass society, and simple answers will be very hard to find. However, I do think, you remember that old thing that said, think globally, act locally? I would kind of drop the first part, and I would just say act locally. Lewis would say this, I never read the newspaper, why would you read one? I mean, if anything happens that you really need to know, someone will tell you that fact. Now, media ecologists talk about the information access or action ratio. So the information action ratio means when I get information, what capacity do I have to do one thing about it? If you get a lot of information every day that you have no capacity to change, maybe you ought to cut that out. Maybe you should just let it go. Attend to what's near, attend to and here I would take this wisdom from Martin Luther, right? One always looks to the neighbor in need because the neighbor in need needs Christ. And who and where is Christ? You. You are to be Christ for the neighbor. So this sort of moral challenge of the Christian life and the Christian community to really be embedded in local community, to be serving local community. I don't think it can be, I mean, it's always provisional. None of us lives forever. There's only so much good you can do. But I think you as a community are doing many of the things that should be done. And I know this in part because I talk a lot to your pastor who thinks about what you all do together. And sharing a meal, having a kitchen in your church, that's a big deal.
And a pastor who cooks.
And a pastor who, I know. I know.
Well, I said we'd wrap up here around 7.
Yeah.
I do actually, as a, I don't know, I'm a pastor, I can't, not that I want the last word, but I'm reminded of a story. And it ties into what you said, also to Rusty's question. In the Czech Republic during communism, there was Václav Havel, and there was another Václav Benda. And Václav Benda was a very faithful Catholic who was imprisoned. And there's a story, and again, everything is politicized in the Eastern Bloc. All of life is politicized. It's all politics and ideology is everywhere. And there's a story that's told about when Václav Benda's family is when he's in prison and they're away, that the mother and her children, they gather around in the country and they read the Lord of the Rings together. And this was their way of resistance. Their way of resisting the sort of politicization of all of life. And I think that this is exactly the question, right? We tend to think about, how do we recover our humanity? What big thing, or initiative, or project, or philosophy? It's very simple things. It's bread and wine and worship. It is beer and sausages. It is gathering together to talk about books that matter and people that matter. And it is making time for embodied life and setting aside our devices to be together and worship together. And so thankful, Mickey, for doing this. And I know he'll stick around for a bit and drink some beers, and we can continue this conversation going. So let's give a round of applause.
How you doing?